that a lot of churches overlook, kind of tolerate. And yet, if we do, we'll end up divided and dying. Peter recognizes in the face of persecution, they're going to need each other more than ever. And that these sins will only divide. If you're going to pull a church together to stand strong during a persecution, to stand up under societal pressure, to become bold in their faith, even when it means imprisonment and torture and death, they're going to need to pull together. They're going to need to hang on to each other and draw strength from each other. This imagery is interesting. It's used in other places in the New Testament, but he says, it's like newborn babes crave pure spiritual milk so that you may grow up in your salvation. And I love this line. Now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. And this was an expression used in Greek often, that you had experienced the essence of something. That they would talk about, now that you have tasted him, what do you think? It was asking your opinion of someone you've just met. But it was this idea that you've experienced something important. And it brings this whole process of maturing and focusing on the walk with God. It's this idea that it's not just salvation isn't a one-time thing. Now that you've tasted the Lord is good, keep growing. Keep going. Hang in there. It's sort of like they've hit this bump in the road and they've stopped, or they're stumbling a little, and he's saying, no, you got to keep moving. Now that you've tasted the Lord is good. It's not a static thing. And the problem that bothers me a lot of times is we get that idea. I've heard a lot of sermons about, you need to get saved. And are you saved? Well, I'm saved. Well, great. Then what? Are we done? There is justification. I love the big terms, justification. It means, someone always explained in simple terms, just as if I'd never sinned. That's what justification means. That when you're baptized into Jesus Christ, he washes your sins away and you are saved. But then there's this other part. It's called sanctification. It's another big fancy term, and all it means is getting cleaned up. It's a cleansing process. And when you were growing up and, when your parents said, well, did you take a shower? You said, well, I took a shower once. You see, cleansing is not a one-time thing, is it? And we appreciate it when people continue the process of cleansing. And we do not appreciate it when they don't. Because you don't just get clean and then it's done. We continue to get dirty and we continue to have to be cleaned up. That as we walk in our Christianity, as we walk with Jesus Christ, as we grow in our faith, the process continues. Sanctification continues. And it's like I've mentioned on several times, God, points out areas I need to work on, and I finally get kind of feeling good about that, and I'm thinking, great. And he says, now there's this other thing. That the process of growing up in the Lord is an ongoing process. We are always being called to higher ground. And so though we are justified, though we are indeed saved, we are also being sanctified. I've always talked about how God will accept you wherever you're at, but thank God he won't leave you there. He won't leave us where he found us. He's drawing us closer to him as we grow up. And that expression, this idea that you've tasted him, he's not saying you need to do this and then find out. He's saying you guys have already experienced Jesus Christ. You've already heard the gospel. You've already felt the Spirit. You've already been justified now that you have experienced the essence of Jesus Christ. Keep growing. Hang in there. Keep drawing closer to God. And then he has all this great imagery, and this is one of those books. There's always been a debate, well, which is more important, the New Testament or the Old Testament? Well, I always say yes, because if you read the New Testament, you quickly find out that you need to understand the Old Testament in order to get a lot of it. And a whole lot of the words that Peter's using are Old Testament references. And again, the question comes up, these are predominantly Gentile churches in Asia Minor. Why would Peter be using Old Testament quotes while writing a letter to a predominantly Gentile church in Asia Minor? You ever thought about that? And the answer is, what Bible do you think the New Testament church was using? You see, the New Testament hadn't been written yet. And they were all hanging out with Old Testaments because that's all they had. And you can preach the gospel from the Old Testament very easily. And that's what they were doing. And these letters were still being written. The New Testament was still being formed. And so even though they were Gentile Christians, they would have been familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. What I find interesting is, in the Old Testament, it's talking about the Israelites and God's people. And it's always funny how there's, almost every country is like this, very ethnocentric. There's Israelites and then there's pagans. And there's Israelites and there's Gentiles, and Israelites and nations. The word Gentiles gets translated a lot of different ways. It was common to throw on Gentile dogs among Israelites. They just referred to anybody who wasn't Israel as anything else. And I grew up in Japan. They're the same way. There's Japanese and then there's Gaijin. And Gaijin means foreigner. It also means enemy. That kind of tells you about the Japanese language, how they view the world. There's Japanese and there's the enemies out there. And that's common in a lot of different cultures. And so this idea that he's talking to Gentiles, pagans, according to the Jews, but now he's translating Old Testament names for the Israelites, which is really the people of God, and he's transferring those names to these Gentiles. If they were familiar with the Old Testament scriptures, they would be aware we're usually the pagans. There's Jews and there's pagans. And he's saying, no, you are the people of God. You have become the people of God. And those who are outside of Christ are the pagans. And he says, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. That he's letting these previously known as pagan Gentiles, and he's saying, no, you are the people of God. You are the temple of God. You are the priesthood of God. You're offering spiritual sacrifice. We're not in the temple anymore, but you're still offering spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable because of your relationship with Jesus Christ. He's using these references and just letting them know you're different now. You are no longer Gentile dogs. That's kind of nice to know, isn't it? You're no longer pagans. You are a holy priesthood, the house of God. Referring to the church as the temple of God was very common throughout the New Testament. The whole people of God have always been referred to by the special status of holy priesthood. That even in the Old Testament, the entire nation was known as a royal priesthood. Now, I always thought that was interesting because if you read a lot of the early teachings, and by the time you get to the first century, they'd certainly turned inward, they'd sort of misunderstood what that means. There were a lot of first century Israelites, first century Jews, who were under the impression that God likes us and nobody else. And that when the Messiah comes, he's going to take over the world and we will just rule over everybody else. But you think about it, this is way back in Exodus. He says, you are a priesthood, the nation of priests. Now, if the Israelites are the priests, who are they priests for? The whole rest of the world. That their job as a nation of Israel was to be the priests to the nations. And somehow, somewhere along the way, they had turned inward. And this is still a message we need to hear today. The church is the priesthood, as we're going to get into this morning. Now, Peter sort of lays a divide through. He says, for those of you who believe and those of you who don't believe. He says, see, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone. The one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. And he's contrasting these groups. And the contrast is, have you accepted Jesus Christ as Lord? Or have you rejected him? Because Jesus means something entirely different to people who've accepted him than he does to people who haven't accepted him. And Peter's drawing a pretty sharp contrast here. Those who believe will be built into this living stone, this temple of God when Christ is revealed. Those who do not believe are going to get crushed by the very stone that the others think is precious. You ever seen something like that where, I've had this experience with modern art. Somebody's standing there saying, wow, that's amazing. And I'm standing there going, wow, that's amazing. We're using the same words, but the meanings are very different. I think I've used this illustration before. I remember in Mombasa once I found the fish market. I grew up in Japan. When I smell fish, I get happy. I get nostalgic. I think it's the greatest smell in the world. The ocean, that salty, fishy smell. It's so great. I ran home. I grabbed Allison. I said, I gotta show you what I found. And I took her in there, and she got out and said, what is that smell? I said, it's fish. She's like, never bring me back here again. And I remember being fascinated with the identical smell. Gave me happy, warm, fuzzy, nostalgic growing up in Japan feelings. And that exact same smell she found absolutely repulsive. And that's what this is talking about. Jesus Christ, to some, a precious, jewel, living, active temple of God. To those who don't believe, it's just a big rock that's going to crush them. It's a big rock that's going to cause them to stumble. It's their death stone. Life to those who believe, death to those who don't. He's drawing a pretty stark contrast. I want to go back to that Old Testament reference because this is important. This is out of Exodus chapter 19, leading up to the Ten Commandments. He says, now if God tells the Israelites, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And God tells them this right before he lays on the Ten Commandments and all that goes on after that. But he tells him, you're going to be a kingdom of priests. And again, the priests were there to intercede between God and, if Israel's the kingdom, priests, then they're supposed to intercede with the rest of the world. That's why he put them there. That's why he continues to put his people in the world. Peter adopts this Old Testament reference and he applies it to these Asian Minor Christians. And I imagine if you were one of those early Christians and you'd read the Old Testament, you might still be feeling a little left out. Peter says, no. You know how God talked to the Israelites? Well, he's given you the same status. You are now the people of God. Paul makes the same comment. He says, you're now children of Abraham. Not by DNA, but by spiritual DNA. That God does DNA different. I like that. It's one of the things I appreciate about Mark's passage this morning when he read in the communion. He talks about, who are my brothers and sisters? Those who do the will of God. See, that's God's DNA test. You're family, you're not family. Family does the will of God. Family accepts and believes in Jesus Christ as Lord. That's spiritual DNA. And according to the New Testament, physical DNA isn't going to matter much. God checks his family by those who do the will of God. And he makes the same reference. He's saying, look, if you're following God, if you've accepted Jesus Christ, you are the people of God. But you are a chosen people. And again, when you read chosen, the first thing you need to think of is chosen for what? How many times do I have to go over this? If someone says, I choose you, what's the first thing that comes to mind? What? Babysitting? Teaching the teenagers? I want to know what you're choosing me for before I accept. God says, you're a chosen people. I've got a job for you. A royal priesthood. This is the king's personal priesthood. That was not unusual in old times. And he's saying now the church is God's royal, the King Jesus, his royal priesthood, personal priesthood. You're a holy nation, a special nation, an unusual nation, a people belonging to God. You see, when God shows up, I want to be able to say with all my heart, I'm with him. If you have any sort of picture of Judgment Day, of that last and final day when Jesus shows up, and boy, will there be a lot of surprise people. And I want to say, I'm with him. Or better yet, to hear him say, he belongs to me. A people belonging to God. Now, what were we chosen for? What are we supposed to be priests about? Why do we belong to God? That you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. That's what we're here for. That's what we're chosen for. That's why we're all priests. To declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Again, with the aliens and strangers. He started out with that. He picks it up. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world, to abstain from sinful desires that war against your heart. Now see, I grew up being called Gaijin. It didn't matter that I spoke fluent Japanese like any other kid at school. It didn't matter that I wore a Japanese uniform to a Japanese school and I followed Japanese mannerisms. I still just kind of stuck out. Number one, I was twice as tall as all the other kids. Not to mention a little paler faced. I know what it's like to be a foreigner, to live as an alien and a stranger. When I was in Kenya, this may surprise you again, but I spoke fluent Swahili, but, I still kind of stuck out. It wasn't possible to blend in. They laughed at us a lot for being Americans in our American ways. I remember one time I was juggling all my boxes while trying to get my keys out of my car to get into my car, and there were two of the Kenyan guys I worked with all the time, and they just started laughing. And I said, what are you guys laughing at? They said, Jolliff, we're both standing here with nothing in our hands. But no, you are an American. You're going to juggle all these boxes and get your keys anyway. All you had to do was ask for help. Any Kenyan would have just asked, said, hey, can you guys help me out? But no, you Americans, you're going to do it yourself. You didn't realize we stick out that much. But he's telling them, look, you need to learn to live as aliens and strangers in this world. We're not supposed to blend in. got a kick out of several congregations. I've always tried to go around and visit people at their workplaces. And it's always fascinating for me to find out how they introduce me. Some of them are very bold. This is Daniel. He's the minister at our congregation. Others are, oh, yeah, this is a friend of mine, Daniel. Better yet is when I say, I'm the minister at their church, and they go, what? He has a minister? Really? I've had that happen a few times. I remember having lunch with a lady in Santa Paula, and a friend that she hadn't seen in 20 years showed up, and she said, well, this is my minister, and the lady nearly fell out of her chair. She said, if you knew Helen when I knew Helen, you'd think the last thing she's ever going to tell anybody was, this is my minister. She had changed a lot. Once again, becoming aliens and strangers in the world. You see, in Christ, our status has been transformed, changed dramatically. We think differently. We make decisions differently. We talk, or should talk differently. It should be clear there's something unusual about us, or as the Bible says, holy. As aliens and strangers in the world, we've got to display the appropriate behavior for the culture that we're headed towards, the culture that we're destined for. You see, we already experience eternal life here, and that culture needs to come out of our pores, rather than the culture that we currently live in. And it's real easy to blend in. A lot of pressure to blend in. But see, when we become Christians, it changes everything. We are Christians who happen to be citizens of the United States of America. But I hope we're not American Christians. I hope we're Christians who happen to be living in America. And I'm very proud of the country we live in. I've traveled around the world. This is a great place to be, a great country to be a part of. But it's not nearly as important as where we're headed. This world is not our home. We've got to get that really straight in order to become what God has called us to be. Live such good lives among the pagans. And this always kind of, I thought, though they accuse you of doing wrong. Now, if the Christians were being Christians, why would people accuse them of doing wrong? If you were actually behaving properly, what's the problem? Well, there were some problems. You see, in the first century, the early Christians were accused of practicing murder, orgies, incest, cannibalism in their secret church meetings, based on expressions like love feasts, brothers and sisters, eating the body, and drinking the blood. That didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of pagans. In first century Roman society, if you didn't like a baby, they didn't really have abortion back then, so you just took the baby out and dumped them in a trash heap, let them die. And the Christians would actually go around and pick all those babies up and take them someplace to feed them and care for them and help them grow up. But when all these pagans heard about, drinking the blood and eating the body, they said, they picked those babies up to eat them. There were a lot of nasty things going on. We know this because there were first century Roman and Greek historians that said that. Tacitus said they were hated because of their vices. And again, the vices being, this drinking of blood and eating flesh. Suetonius said, Christians are a class of people animated by a novel and dangerous superstition. I mean, one God? Really? Was where he was coming from. There were a lot of bad rumors going around about Christians for all the wrong reasons. The day he visits us, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. Here's the point. So that they will see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Now, this day he visits us is an interesting phrase in the Old Testament. It means day of salvation. It also means the day of judgment in all its positive and negative connotations. It's used both ways. And this double meaning is based on whether we follow God, or whether we have a relationship with God in Jesus Christ or not. Those who believe and those who don't believe. And so Peter's deliberately pulling this Old Testament phrase and applying it now because it's the same meaning. When Jesus shows up, it's going to be the day of salvation for some and the day of judgment for others. When he says living such good lives, that if you read through 1 Peter carefully, you'll know he's always contrasting this with being Christ-like. So when he's not talking about some vague idea of just being good. He's talking about living like Christ called us to follow his example. So what's our call to action today? The status has been changed. We're a royal priesthood, a chosen people. We need to understand the day he visits us is coming. And you might say, well, Daniel, they've been saying that for 2,000 years, which means it's 2,000 years closer to coming. That he will visit us. Jesus is coming back. Maranatha was that early church greeting. He's going to return, and we know it. He will visit. Will it be Judgment Day or the day of salvation? The answer is yes, depending on whether we accept or reject what God is calling us to do. It's pretty simple, pretty complex in all of its implications, but it's pretty simple. What exactly is he calling us to do? He made it clear. You're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. That's what he's calling us to do. So this week, last week we were preparing our minds for action. This week, prepare our minds for action to declare God's praises. I hope if you introduce me as your minister at your workplace, that people won't fall out of their chairs. I hope that people around you are aware that there's something unusual about you. I hope that people that come in contact with me notice I don't talk like they do. I have a little different perspective on life. That there's something about us that stands out, that sticks out, and when they ask, how come you're different, we will declare the praises of God who called us out of darkness and into his wonderful light. If you have any needs this morning, please come as we stand and sing.